All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling something pretty controversial, to say the least. Chris Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation, SFF. Seems like every time you turn around, there's a new headline. We've got articles, forum posts, legal documents, even some heated social media discussions you sent over.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack, for sure. A real tangled web, you know? We're dealing with a long history, a whole network of organizations, and some serious accusations. It's definitely not a simple story.
Okay, so where do we even begin with something like this?
Well, I think the best place to start is with the man himself, Chris Butler. Though he's also known as Siddhasvarupa Dasa and Jagadguru Siddhaswarupananda Paramahamsa, among other names. He's the founder of SEF, and from what I've seen, his personality really jumps out from the sources you've provided.
Yeah, some of the things he said are, well, let's just say they're not your typical spiritual leader kind of talk.
Colorful might be one way to put it.
Colorful, is putting it mildly. Like this quote, and I'm not sure I can even repeat this without cringing, but here goes. My disciples are all #shag king neophytes. Wow. Where do you even go from there?
Right. It's definitely not the language you expect from someone claiming to be, a spiritual guru.
And that's just one example. There are others that are even more, let's say, eyebrow-raising.
It seems like a pattern. One minute he's preaching about detachment from material possessions. The next he's allegedly complaining about the lack of space on a private jet chartered with SIF money.
That's wild. Private jets.
Yeah, that's what some former members have described. It definitely makes you question the sincerity of those teachings, right?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, it's one thing to talk the talk, but walking the walk is a whole other story.
Absolutely. And then you start to see this bigger picture of potential hypocrisy and, even more troubling, possible control and manipulation. That's a theme that keeps coming up when you look at SIF, especially when you delve into the SIF boarding school in Baguio City.
The one in the Philippines, right? That's where things start to get really dark, isn't it?
Yeah, it's tough to read some of the accounts from former students. They describe an environment that was far from the idyllic spiritual haven it was advertised to be.
There are former students like Ian Koviak and Rama Ranson who have publicly spoken out about their experiences.
Right, their stories are pretty disturbing. I mean, they were just kids, and they were allegedly exposed to some pretty inappropriate stuff, including, Butler's lectures.
Which, as I understand it, included sexually explicit content and some pretty hateful homophobic rants.
Yeah, it's really hard to stomach. And then you have those allegations of sexual abuse at the school, including one case involving Siddha Belord, who, and this is where it gets even more disturbing, is Butler's stepson.
It's just awful to think about what those kids might have gone through. And if these allegations of a cover-up are true, well, that just makes it even worse.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder about the organization's priorities, Are they really about promoting peace and harmony like they claim?
Right. Or is there something else going on beneath the surface? And speaking of things going on beneath the surface, we need to talk about the Gabbard family and their involvement with LIF.
That's one of the most surprising aspects of this whole thing, for sure. Mike Gabbard, his wife Carol, and their daughter Tulsi, they've all been involved with SIF for years.
And it's not just casual involvement either. They've been really active in the organization.
It definitely raises some eyebrows when you consider Tulsi Gabbard's political career, right? She was a U.S. representative, even a Democratic presidential candidate. You don't usually see that level of political engagement from someone so connected to a group as, controversial as SIF.
Yeah, and it's definitely fueled a lot of debate about her beliefs and whether they're influenced by SIF and their teachings, especially when you consider her past support for her father's anti-LGBTQ plus activism.
That definitely complicates the narrative, to say the least. And it kind of highlights how SIF's reach extends beyond just the spiritual realm.
Okay, so we've got Butler, the school, the Gabbards, and then there's this whole web of businesses linked to SIF. We're talking about a grocery chain, down to earth, and then this multi-level marketing company, QNet.
Right, it's a pretty intricate network. Down to earth, on the surface, seems like a successful health food store. But then you dig a little deeper and you see connections to key figures in SIF, like Allan Tibby, also known as Akariadas. He was involved with the SIF school in the Philippines and also has a prominent role in QNet.
And speaking of QNet, that's where things get really interesting, or maybe I should say concerning, because they've been accused of operating as a pyramid scheme.
In multiple countries, actually, and that's a big red flag. A pyramid scheme is basically a model where participants earn money primarily by recruiting new members, not from selling actual products or services.
Yeah, it's notoriously unsustainable and can leave a lot of people in financial ruin. So the fact that we're seeing key civ figures involved in QNet, it definitely raises some ethical questions.
To put it mildly.
Especially when you remember that quote where Butler allegedly said, "Are those assholes still running that store in Lahaina? Why don't they give it to DTE, assholes?" And they call themselves, "My disciples make all kinds of money while their kids skate and surf. Assholes, they should give it to me." It's a lot to take in.
It is. It's starting to feel less like a spiritual community and more like a business empire, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and it begs the question, where is all that money going?
Exactly. Especially when you consider the accounts from former members about working for SIF for little to no pay. Some even claim to have spent their own savings to support the organization. It just adds another layer of complexity and honestly concern to this whole story.
Okay, so we've got Butler, the school, the Gabbards, QNet, and then there's this one figure, Patrick Bowler. He went by the aliases, the Guru, and Top Hat. He was a major donor to SIF and the school in the Philippines.
Right. Bowler is an interesting character, to say the least. The irony is that he was actually a convicted drug trafficker.
Wait, what? A convicted criminal? That's a pretty strange connection, isn't it? What was he doing involved with the spiritual organization?
Yeah, you have to wonder about that. And it raises questions about SIF's vetting process, their ethics, and what they were willing to overlook in exchange for, well, financial support.
It's almost like every layer we peel back reveals something even more intriguing and honestly more disturbing.
That's how it's starting to feel, right? Like a real-life thriller unfolding before our very eyes.
Seriously. And we haven't even gotten into the allegations of cult-like behavior and the impact this whole experience has had on former members.
That's next on our list. We're going to delve into the psychological tactics allegedly used by SIF, the struggles faced by those who left the organization, and try to understand the lasting impact of this whole complex and controversial story.
So last time we were talking about Chris Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation, some pretty serious accusations. Before we go any further, I think it's important to just, acknowledge that this can be pretty heavy stuff.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're talking about allegations of exploitation, manipulation, even abuse. We definitely need to approach this with sensitivity and, a critical eye.
Right, exactly. And for anyone listening who might be affected by any of this, please know that there are resources out there. But let's get back to this web we've started to untangle here. We left off talking about the financial side of things. QNet and those allegations of a pyramid scheme structure.
Right, and I think it's really important to understand how a pyramid scheme actually works, because the structure itself is so inherently, exploitative. You have those people at the top who are really benefiting the most, and then those at the bottom are often left with nothing but, debt and broken promises.
So how does QNet tie into this bigger picture of SIF and Chris Butler? Can you connect the dots for us?
Well, as we mentioned, there are several key SIF figures who are deeply involved with QNet. We've got Allan Tibby, also known as Acharya Das, who is closely linked to the SIF school in the Philippines and has a prominent role in QNet. And then you have Vijay Eswaran, a co-founder of QNet, who has close ties to Butler.
And remember that quote we came across, the one where Butler allegedly said, "Are those assholes still running that store in Lahaina? Why don't they give it to DTE, assholes?" And they call themselves, "My disciples make all kinds of money while their kids skate and surf. Assholes, they should give it to me."
Oh, yeah, that one. That quote really stuck with me because it reveals a lot about, a sense of entitlement, I think. This idea that his followers' success is somehow owed to him. And honestly, that kind of mentality aligns perfectly with the structure of a pyramid scheme, right? The people at the top, they expect to reap the rewards of everyone below them.
And it's pretty contradictory to all the teachings about detachment from material possessions that Butler's supposed to, be all about. Seems like a pretty big double standard to me.
Exactly. It's a big one. And it goes to show why it's so important to look beyond what's being said, to really examine the actions and the systems in place.
Speaking of actions, what about all those allegations from former SIF members about working for, no pay or very little? How does that fit in here?
Well, it's another example of those power dynamics that we keep seeing within SIF and how they seem to benefit, those at the top. You have these dedicated followers who are giving their time and their energy, often making big sacrifices. And meanwhile, there are figures like Joseph Bismark, who's also heavily involved in QNet, living in these luxury properties in Hawaii that are reportedly used by Butler and his, inner circle.
So there's a huge difference in wealth and lifestyle between the people at the top and those at the bottom.
Oh, a huge difference. And that brings us to a pretty big question. Is S truly about spiritual growth, or is it more about, power and control?
That's a good question. And I think it leads us right into the allegations of cult-like behavior within SIF. We've danced around it a little, but let's just get right to it. What are we talking about when we use that phrase?
So first off, it's important to note that there's no one definition of a cult. But there are some characteristics and tactics that are often associated with these groups.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Sure. Things like isolating members from their families and friends, demanding absolute obedience to the leader, using fear and guilt to control behavior, and, suppressing any kind of critical thinking.
And are we seeing that kind of stuff within SIF?
Well, based on all the information you've shared, yeah, there's definitely evidence suggesting it. For example, we have these former students from that school in the Philippines who have talked about, being discouraged from forming those close bonds with their families. They were basically taught that their devotion to Butler should be above all else.
Oh, that's so sad. I mean, these are kids essentially being separated from their families and, indoctrinated.
It's heartbreaking. And the long-term effects of that kind of isolation, they can be really profound. Former SEF members, they've talked about how difficult it was to leave and, reintegrate into society. They felt lost and confused and struggled to connect with people outside of that SEF bubble.
Yeah, it's like they were conditioned to think in a certain way, to follow a certain path, and then when that's gone, they're left with, well, nothing.
Right. It can be totally disorienting. And that's why it's so important to recognize those warning signs, those tactics that are used to control and manipulate people.
So we're seeing evidence of these tactics within SIF. What does that tell us about Chris Butler himself?
Well, it definitely makes you question his leadership style, his motivations. Is he really about his followers' well-being? Or is it more about, maintaining his power and influence?
It's hard to believe he's all about spiritual growth when you think about that quote about him demanding his followers give him their business. It just doesn't add up.
I know. There's a big disconnect there. And I think that's what makes this so compelling, but also, unsettling.
It's like we're peeling back layers of an onion, and each layer is just more, well, pungent, more complex.
That's a great way to put it.
And speaking of complex, let's not forget about the political side of this whole thing.
Oh, right. The Gabbard family. They really add another layer of intrigue to this story, don't they? We've got Mike Gabbard, a prominent figure in Hawaiian politics, and his wife, Carol, both deeply involved in SUF. And then there's Tulsi, who's had this high-profile political career.
Yeah, her connection to SUF has definitely been controversial, especially when you look at her past views and, her father's anti-LGBTQ plus activism. Makes you wonder how far SIF's influence actually reaches.
It's a good question, and I think it shows how important it is to be aware of those connections that shape, the political landscape.
So we've got spirituality, business, politics, and allegations of manipulation and exploitation. It's a lot to keep track of.
It's a lot, and it's complex, that's for sure. But I think it's important to remember that we're not here to, demonize anyone.
Right, we're not here to judge. Just present the information and let the listeners come to their own conclusions.
Exactly. Our goal here is to, shed some light on what seems to be going on within SEF, to explore this potential for exploitation and highlight how important critical thinking is, especially when you're looking at spiritual leaders and their teachings.
Because at the end of the day, it's about empowering people, giving them the knowledge to ask the tough questions.
And trusting their gut. If something feels wrong, if what people are saying doesn't line up with what they're doing, it's important to pay attention to those red flags.
Okay, so we've talked about the allegations of cult-like behavior, the financial stuff, the political connections. What else do we need to dig into here?
Well, we haven't really talked about Chris Butler's background. I mean, his past is kind of shrouded in mystery, but there are some things in the sources you provided that give us a little glimpse into, how he became the leader of SEF.
Oh, that's interesting. What did you find out?
Well, before he founded SEF, he was involved in another spiritual group. It was called the Krishna Yoga Community, linked to the Sivananda ashram. He already had a following even before he joined ISKCON. And when he did join ISKCON in the early 70s, he brought a bunch of his followers with him and even donated a significant amount of money. So it was quite an entrance.
So he wasn't exactly new to spiritual leadership.
Not at all. But even his time in ISKCON was marked by conflict. He clashed with other leaders and, well, eventually broke away to form SEF.
Seems like he's got a history of, challenging authority and doing things his own way.
That's a great point. And it might explain his unique take on, ISKCON teachings and how he tends to position himself as the ultimate authority on all things spiritual.
So he basically created his own little kingdom, and he's the king.
It seems that way. And that brings us right back to that question of power and control, doesn't it?
Right. Is SEF really about spiritual growth? or about fulfilling Chris Butler's ambitions? That's the million-dollar question, I guess.
Yeah, it really is. And it's something we'll keep exploring as we dig deeper into this story.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. Controversial teachings, allegations of cult-like behavior, ties to politics and business. Chris Butler and CF, it's a wild ride.
Yeah, no kidding. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important to try and piece it all together. See if we can make sense of how these different pieces fit into a bigger picture.
Totally. We started with Chris Butler himself. His background, his rise to leadership, that tendency to challenge authority and do things his own way. And of course, we can't forget those outrageous quotes, the lavish lifestyle. It's a stark contrast to his teachings about detaching from material possessions.
Yeah, that disconnect between what he says and what he does, it's a big theme here, isn't it? Like with those allegations of exploitation, former members talking about working for next to nothing, while people like Joseph Bismarck, with his ties to QNet, are living the good life. It's hard to ignore.
It really is. It's almost like there are two Seths. The one they present to the public, all about peace and harmony and spiritual growth. And then the one some members experience, where devotion and obedience are, well, kind of expected.
That's a great point, and it brings us back to that question. Does Seth, under Butler's leadership, show those cult-like tendencies we talked about? Isolating members, demanding obedience, using fear and guilt to control behavior, discouraging critical thinking.
And remember, we saw evidence of that stuff in the sources we looked at, especially from those former students at the SIF school in the Philippines. Those stories are tough to hear.
Yeah, especially those allegations of sexual abuse at the school and the alleged cover-up by SIF leaders. It really makes you question their priorities. Are they really putting the well-being of their members first?
It's a disturbing picture, for sure. But it's important to remember these are allegations. And Seth has denied a lot of them.
Right. We're just presenting the information from the sources you provided. There are multiple perspectives out there. It's important for everyone to do their own research,
Totally. Form your own conclusions. So after all this, what are some of the key takeaways here? What should our listeners really understand about Chris Butler and Saif?
I think the biggest takeaway is, critical thinking is so important, especially when it comes to faith and spirituality. Don't just blindly accept what someone tells you, even if they seem enlightened or, divinely inspired.
It's easy to get swept up in the charisma or the promises, but we got to look deeper, examine the evidence, and trust your gut.
Absolutely. And that applies to any group or leader, not just Saif. If they're demanding obedience, claiming to have all the answers, it's a red flag.
We also saw how power can be used in these organizations and how people can be exploited.
Yeah, for sure. Awareness is key. Look out for those signs like being isolated from loved ones or feeling pressured financially. Or if you're discouraged from questioning the leader's teachings, that's a big one.
Well, this has been quite the deep dive. I feel like I've learned a lot. Hope our listeners have too.
Me too. It's been, unsettling at times, but there's a positive message here, I think.
Ooh, what's that?
It's about empowerment. Being informed, asking questions, trusting yourself. We have the power to choose our own path, to find what's true and authentic for us.
That's a great point. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's been an interesting one, to say the least.
You're welcome. And remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand, the better choices we can make.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for listening, everyone, and until next time, keep on diving deep.